goes all in the same cloud. Thanks. So welcome to the second panel of the day. So we have a panel on sex work and the world of work, and we have 4 presenters. So first, oh, just a moment. I will just see that Abhilasha and Tanya are unmuted. Yeah, they can unmute themselves now. I'm sorry about that interruption. So yeah, so we have 4 presenters. So we have Tanya Burman and Abhilasha Jain, who are feminist scholars from Ambedkar University, Delhi, and Jawaharlal Nehru University, respectively, and they will talk about sex work through the lens of care, a South Asian perspective. As a second speaker, we have Priya Sharma from the Indian Institute of Technology, talking about sex workers as epistemic agents. And then we have our own Sharmila Parmanand, who is a ESRC postdoctoral fellow at the LSE Department of Gender Studies, and she will talk about sex work, motherhood, and the politics of virtuous labor. And we'll start with Tanya and Abhilasha. So please go ahead.
Just click on share screen. We are having a slight trouble in sharing our screen. Sorry for the delay.
No worries, just take your time and yeah. We can see it now, yeah.
So our paper is titled Sex Work Through the Lens of Care, as Niina already pointed out. We are attempting to explore how sex work is positioned in feminist scholarship in India through a reflection on debates around another labor form that spins on a similar axis, that is bar dancing. Bar dancing quite literally signifies dancing in bars and is generally understood as a performance by women for male patrons. It involves dancing on a slightly raised platform or stage, on peppy Bollywood numbers, in lehengas or saris that are tailored to show off the dancers' bodies. It became popular in Mumbai, the capital city of Maharashtra, then Bombay, in the 2000s, and it is here that the various legal arguments and feminist debates around the issue are centered. Legally, male bar dance or sex work is unrecognized under the Indian law. Thus, our paper would limit its focus to women. Nonetheless, it is important to highlight that most radical feminist scholarship around bar dancing and sex work in India has primarily focused on women as victims and subjects of sexual exploitation. Moving on, with the influx of migrant workers who flocked to Mumbai after the British East India Company developed it as a port, demand for entertainment in budget-friendly restaurants and eateries, which around the clock were also increased. The colonial government marked certain establishments as playhouses, where dance and music performances, folk theatre, and silent movies were allowed. The post-independent state's liquor policy, which was attempting to promote the consumption of alcohol, granted licenses for ghazals, classical music, and dance performances, as well as cabaret shows in these places. And from there on, Maharashtra witnessed a mushrooming of dance bars. However, despite the increase in this business and the alleged claim that involved a lot of money, the government did not make any attempt to regulate dance bars. And well, until 2001, these spaces functioned on the self-legitimized rule of the Hafta Raj, or weekly payment that were given to the police officials. Responding to claims from members of the Legislative Assembly, that dance bars were corrupting the youth, the then Deputy Chief Minister announced his intent to shut down dance bars in the state with immediate effect in 2005. This was followed by the passing of the Maharashtra Police Amendment Bill, which banned, I quote, holding of performances or dance of any kind at eating houses, permit rooms, or beer bars, unquote, across the state. In 2006, the ban was challenged by 9 petitioners in the High Court on grounds that it was an infringement on the constitutional rights of equality, as well as the right to practice any profession. The court accepted this claim and overturned the bill. In September 2014, a state-appointed committee recommended a complete ban on bar girls in hotels and restaurants in order, and I want all of you to pay attention, in order to reduce crime against women, following which the Maharashtra government put a ban on dance bars, which was again struck down by the Supreme Court. The government again passed an act to restrict dance bars in 2016. The Supreme Court diluted some of its provisions in 2019, but it also accepted the general sort of premise of the act that, and with, I quote, no performance of dance shall remotely be expressive of any kind of obscenity in any manner. Along with this, other guidelines were set for bar owners, which eventually made it difficult for dancers to return to bar dancing. And this controversy sort of remains unsolved even today. What is interesting for us, and that can be discerned from the above discussion, is that bar dancers were presented as both evil women from whose corrupting influence the nation's youth had to be saved, and as victims of trafficking and exploitation who needed to be saved themselves. Statements given by ministers in the State Assembly were in stark contrast to the paternalistic language of the bill. Some of them are on the screen. For example, will you send your daughters to dance in bars? An MLA asked his fellows. Similar statements like, I quote, these women who are opposing the ban, we will make their mothers dance. Or, I quote, these women who dance naked, they don't deserve any sympathy, unquote. These were circulated freely in the State Assembly. Sweetie or Savitri sort of representing two very different contrasting imageries of Indian women. Who will you choose? Questioned the leaflets distributed door to door along with the morning newspapers during this time. Several women's organizations and women wing of political parties, on the other hand, welcomed the ban as a necessary state intervention to free women who were victims of socio-cultural formulations and economic exploitation. Non-governmental organizations working against anti-trafficking alleged that the bars were in fact brothels and dens of prostitution where minors were trafficked, that the government had been drawing revenue from such sites of women's exploitation furthered the moral urgency for the ban. Moving on to the initial feminist response to the ban can be located within this perspective. The pro-ban advocates argued that bar dancing was an extension of caste-based sexual exploitation of women at the hands of upper caste class men who were mostly bar owners as well as the clients. Concerns regarding trafficking further fueled these arguments. Bar dancers were understood as poor, illiterate women, single mothers or wives of drunken husbands, poverty-stricken, belonging to traditional performing communities, working in dance bars out of necessity or compulsion. Along with the ban, feminist organizations demanded rehabilitation and skill development so that these women could find other, better avenues of employment. Whether it was by looking at dancing in bars as exploitative in itself, or as a work which ought not to be done by good women, feminists thought unilaterally aided in marginalizing bar dancers rather than giving them the space to articulate their own positions and concerns. As a result, when bar dancers themselves took to the streets to protest against the ban, pro-ban social workers and feminists were left dumbfounded. As Flavia Agnes, a women rights lawyer and activist, recalls, when the Bar Girls Union approached her to present them, Agnes was confused and felt reluctant to join the anti-ban side. By her own admission, Agnes, much like other members of women's rights groups at that time, were themselves involved in movement against the moral corruption in fashion parades, beauty contests, and the indecent representation of women in Hindi films. Bar Girls Union, on the other hand, stressed that dancing in bars was their source of income and the only means of earning more than a meager wage. Several dancers had previously worked as domestic workers, rack pickers, small-time factory workers, salespersons, or as nurses, waitresses, tailors, and shop assistants. They argued that dancing in bars provided them with a considerable salary, stability, support, a collective identity, and security that other avenues did not. These assertions by the bar dancers themselves and the research work that women's studies centers in Mumbai carried out later brought feminists face to face with the dominant upper caste class moralist underpinnings of Indian feminism. This made them consider anti-ban advocacy.
Feminist anti-ban advocacy stressed on how bar dancing must be recognized as work. Several research groups submitted their reports to the Supreme Court, highlighting the government's need to safeguard the rights of bar dancers. These studies envisioned a more gender-balanced working space where women were co-owners of dance bars, men were also performers, and the bars were accessible to female viewers. As evident, feminist movements or anti-ban movements relied heavily on state mechanisms to fight against the same mechanisms that first put them in those precarious positions. To this effect, an important strategic move for this movement was to distance itself from any actual or implied sex work or buying and selling of sexual services, the latter then becoming the ultimate space of women's sexual exploitation, as well as the only one requiring discussions around sex, sexuality, and the erotic. The work part of dancing was highlighted in feminist arguments, limiting it to an imitation of Bollywood heroines and strictly locating sexual eroticism in Indian tradition and Bollywood gyrations. Hereon, bar dancing was transformed into a legitimate concern for feminist advocacy. It was presented as that which was not sex work. In fact, it was better than sex work as it did not involve transactional sex. Bar dancers similarly were sanitized into chaste, homely wives or daughters who took to dancing and only dancing in bars as a means to earn an income not for the self, but for the family. Bar dance was dignified by removing it from the context of sexual labor. It was stressed as an entertainment, a concept that was in line with the 20th century growing consumerism. Interestingly, since most bar dancers were from marginal communities which are left outside of the hegemonic conceptualizations of morally pure, chaste womanhood, this feminist reconfiguration of bar dancers as moral beings had profound implications. Did this move really break free from morality, or did it assimilate a section of hitherto so-called immoral women by erasing their caste context over and above other sections of women, that is the sex workers? Thus, while the judicial overturning of the ban against bar dancing was celebrated as a triumph of women's right to livelihood, the judgment and the feminist stance can now be understood as reiterating and deepening the distinctions which are already made between morally good and bad women and their labor. But then, whatever happened to the sex worker in modern India? Not only did the majority feminist response to this debate further stigmatize sex work and alienate sex workers from the women's movement, but it also failed to open up a space for discussions of the markets of women's sexual labor beyond the arbitrary legal distinctions made within the same. Such a demarcation of boundaries has prevented us from exploring the similarities between these labor forms, particularly in the context of a society which is severely hierarchized on the basis of gender and caste, determining individual and communities' claims to respect, dignity, and livelihood. We also would discuss a 2013 documentary titled Tales of the Night Fairies, which puts forth this complexity perfectly. So the movie begins with a Nukkar Natak, that is a street play, And moving on to the introduction shot of Sonagachi, a neighborhood of brothels in Kolkata. The narrator starts with a personal narrative telling the viewers about a common practice in the area. That is, the houses marked with a signboard, "These houses belong to decent people." The narrator's endeavor to make the movies begin with the question, who lives in the other houses? This marking of decent people in actuality functions as a demarcation of the other. It is a remark on the people who are not decent. This instance shows how the question of the sexual is ultimately a question to modesty, to the indecent, which, when contextualized in its colonial history, foregrounds how we continue to hold on to similar demarcations of perversions and deviations, where women who deserve to be protected and women who deserve to be corrected, rehabilitated, or erased were determined on the basis of workings of caste and gender. Here runs deep an idea of a modern and developed nation, or at least a developing one, where no woman needs to enter such professions. This is reflected in the language of care, in the making and remaking of laws responding to harm and violence against women.
So, in terms of conclusion, we have sort of come up. We have some reflections on care work, and there are three ways in which our paper can be understood to reflect on that. Firstly, care as benevolence, as visible in feminist response to those who provide sexual services. This approach is unable to move beyond a reductionist perspective that focuses only on how women end up doing bar dance or sex work, as these are ultimately exploitative, violent, and unfit for women. In order to rescue and rehabilitate them, this perspective first establishes transactional sexual labor as undignified. In that sense, then bar dance is removed from sexual labor in order for it to be that subject which can then be sort of supported for its rights and so on. Second understanding of care that can be discerned from our discussion is care as the state's paternalism, which works both to protect the society from corrupting influences and to protect women from sexual exploitation and loss of dignity. Here, while terms like obscene, indecent, immoral, which are readily used in a variety of laws around similar themes, they are often left for social, cultural, casteist, and religious interpretations and presumptions. For the informal sector, for example, including bar dance and sex work has been left outside the purview of the Prevention of Sexual Harassment of Women at the Workplace Act of 2013. More recently, the state has also opposed the Supreme Court's direction to refrain police harassment of sex workers and respect their consent. Here we must ask, what makes the sexual the easy target of care from the state? What are the terms of receiving care from the modern nation state? Thirdly, we explore care in collectivity as envisioned and practiced by these groups themselves. The Bharatiya Bar Girls Union, for example, legitimized itself as an actor in the struggle against the ban through its insistence on collectivity. It issued ID cards to dancers, underscoring their power in numbers in light of police brutality and harassment. Furthermore, this collectivity allowed bar dancers to negotiate their own terms of public visibility, as well as their involvement in decision-making, as members of the union took to the streets to protest with their faces covered. Similarly, sex workers' unionization is a show of agency, of collectivization in the face of marginalization, even in the most progressive of spaces. It foregrounds and problematizes state governance and carceral claims of most actors that repeatedly cast sex work as involuntary and thereby a discourse limited to human trafficking. It is a claim to their multiple identities of and as sex workers, mothers, women, as well as citizens. It is also a claim to self. By asserting their right to collectivize, they are also paving way to establish a self that is situated in their community. For example, the Sex Workers Organization of Sonagachi, Calcutta, the Unstoppable Women Synthesis Committee, organized a Mashal rally loosely translating to a torch rally on May Day or the International Labour Day to mark their contribution as workers and to demand for a legal recognition of sex work as a legitimate form of work. It is not a voiceless entity waiting for its turn to speak up. Sex workers are there. They have already been speaking up, forming relations of care in the community and organizing on their own principles and in collaboration with academic feminist groups.
Our attempt here has been to show how the feminist response to debates on bar dancing ended up creating fissures within the movement. It made divisions and classifications on the basis of who could be made an ideal female subject for feminist politics, othering sex workers in its wake. Our paper tried to highlight some intersections that not only needed our attention, but may also allow us to imagine a collective action, a framework of care that is not based on categorizations. That is to say that sex worker cannot remain a homogeneous group ready to receive paternalism, policing, and harassment in the name of care. To conclude, we have to depolice the ethics of care, prevention, and rehabilitation to think of care in ways that allow the sex workers freedom and democratic future that they desire, instead of the one that the law and the state mechanisms desire for them. I think we would end with a very short clip from the documentary that we mentioned earlier, which would actually go on to reflect on all of the points we've tried to make.
Thank you, Tanya and Abhilasha, for this very insightful talk on the kind of intersections of respectability, care, work, and feminist activism. We'll now move to Priya Sharma. Priya, are you ready? And could you please stop sharing, Tanya and Abhilasha?
Yeah, I'll try to share my screen now. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes. For some reason, my face shows in top of your
Okay.
slides. Maybe remove it. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So thank you so much, and a very good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, but from a very hot afternoon in Bombay. I would first like to thank the organizers, Niina and Sharmila, for putting together this very thought-provoking and for me in particular, highly informative symposium around different ways of locating and rethinking care in relation to sex work, and for giving me this opportunity to share my insights with you all today. Unlike all of you, I believe I had put in my notes most of you, but I think unlike all of you, I do not primarily work in the area of sex work, but what I do work is in the area of care and feminism. In particular, I work in the area of ethics of care or care ethics, which is a mid-20th century feminist moral and political philosophical approach with interdisciplinary roots that looks at care as the central concern and condition of human existence. It centralizes relationality, vulnerability, responsibility, interdependence, and interconnectedness. In my ongoing doctoral work at IIT Bombay in India, I look at the regulation debates around surrogacy in India, particularly in the context of the recently enacted the Surrogacy Regulation Act 2021 that has banned commercial surrogacy, where a surrogate could have been paid for her surrogacy services, stating and claiming it to be a highly exploitative practice. And now the law only permits altruistic surrogacy, where only the necessary medical, legal, and some miscellaneous prescribed expenses, which are yet to be totally determined, can be paid to a surrogate. But a surrogate necessarily is not to be identified as a working subject and is not to be paid. Now, instead, the discourse around this act, especially the Select Committee report, which was presented in Parliament in 2020 on this bill, lays out how an altruistic surrogate is looked at, and why, in their perspective, it is better to only permit altruistic surrogacy. And altruistic, or what at times is interchangeably called in the discourse of regulation by the state, ethical surrogacy, as opposed to then default exploitative commercial surrogacy, seems to be operating with an identity of an ethical surrogate who acts selflessly, owing to her care and compassion towards the intended parents. And it's therefore an ideal, model, and divine person who does what normal mothers would do without expecting any monetary benefits in return. In my work, I then complicate such understanding of the identity of surrogates as well as exploitation on the part of the state that seems to take a surrogate as perennially exploited and passive victim in commercial surrogacy. And I juxtapose it with the self-understanding of surrogates and establish them in the fused roles of caregivers, care receivers, and epistemic agents, following a decolonized lens of ethics of care. Now, the conflation of surrogacy and sex work, or its comparison, have been potent tools to either decry surrogacy as another form of prostitution, where one sells one's womb, or establish the credibility and more dignified position of surrogates as opposed to the sex workers. In my own fieldwork, I often find surrogates, especially in the wake of the threat of then impending ban on commercial surrogacy, which has now already become a reality. I have often found surrogates comparing what they do with sex work and establishing their superior position. They would say that there is nothing wrong in it. It's all technology. And at least we don't sleep with other men or do any ganda kaam, which is translated as dirty or impure work, referring to sex work to support ourselves and our children. So they establish their superior position as opposed to surrogates, as opposed to sex workers. And I have here also, recently I saw Sharmila's recent paper, where she has talked about domestic workers and sex workers, and she has mapped different facets of care there, and she terms it in the sense of always versus other. So sex worker or sex work is taken as always versus other. That is what I also kind of resonated in my field notes. Then a similar observation is also found in already published ethnographic literature on surrogacy. For example, Amrita Pandey, whose highly cited ethnographic work now, Wombs in Labor, which was published in 2014, she also shows that how this comparison between surrogates and sex workers is used by the clinics themselves to discipline the surrogates, and by saying that, oh, you're not like them. Then the comparison between how the government looks at surrogates and sex workers is also clear, as surrogates, but only altruistic surrogates and not commercial surrogates, are exalted in their position, as I showed in the previous slide, as divine, selfless workers, but sex workers are always stigmatized. However, the similarity lies in the fact that participation in neither of these activities, either like commercial surrogacy or sex work, is seen under the ambit of work. And also that both the commercial surrogates and commercial sex workers are seen as perennially victimized passive objects who hold no epistemic agency. For example, I take here an advisory which was put out by the National Human Rights Commission in the first wave, after the first wave of COVID-19 in India in 2020, under the title Human Rights Advisory on Rights of Women in the Context of COVID-19, which was the advisory around women who are workers, either formal or informal workers, it was a guideline, legally non-binding guideline, but it was a guideline to various states to provide whatever relief they were providing to workers to women. And there they had put sex workers under informal workers as a category, which, mind you, this aspect was brought into this advisory with the efforts of national network of sex workers in India, which is a network of sex workers and allies across the country. So they also had sent their recommendations, and it was seen as a very, very important step. And I remember because I got to know about it just the day it came out, because I am a part of a feminist group in Bombay, and everyone was very celebratory that finally sex workers have been identified as informal workers. However, within a few days, this advisory was retracted or rather revised when one prominent anti-trafficking activist objected to putting sex workers in the category of informal workers. So not only did the voices of sex workers got suppressed, but any rightful care towards them was yet again couched under a humanitarian intervention, because this particular advisory in its revised format removed I time and again keep saying surrogates because I work with surrogates, but this advisory put sex workers in informal worker category in the original version, but after this anti-trafficking activist objected, the revised version did not put them in the category of informal workers, but just mentioned that they should be helped on humanitarian grounds. So that's why I say that not only the voices of sex workers get suppressed in such way, but any rightful care towards them is yet again couched under a humanitarian intervention. I argue that looking at such a discourse from the lens of care ethics can give us some fruitful directions. Now, since yesterday, there have been a few mentions of the scholars engaged in care ethics already, like Joan Tronto in Julia's inaugural wonderful keynote speech, Daniel Langston's definition of care, or Eva Federkite's idea of interdependency in Pankuri's brilliant exploration of the impact of raids and imprisonment in Delhi's GB Road area. And there might be a few more references, but I sadly missed the later part of session yesterday. So in my argument today, I employ the lens of care ethics following Joan Tronto, who is one of the pioneers in the field of ethics of care. Her contribution through her works in 1993, 2013, and 2015 to critically reflect on the above mentioned instance of the revision of the advisory of the National Human Rights Commission at the behest of a prominent anti-trafficking activist. So Tronto, referring to a previous definition that she had put together with her colleague Bernice Fisher, states that care means, in the most general sense, a species activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we may live in it as well as possible. That word includes our bodies, our cells, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. Now, like a lot of people mentioned yesterday, Tronto acknowledges that this definition is quite broad. However, she goes on to establish that though care is fundamental and it's everywhere, and as a fundamental condition of human existence, it is often privatized, devalued, and invisibilized. Given care inherently involves unequal power relations between the one who gives care and the one who receives care, one needs to be careful, she says, while stating what a good care would look like. She says that care is more than just good intentions. It is both a disposition and is always oriented towards the other. It is relational and is directed towards meeting the need of the other or oneself. She says that care is always ongoing and is deeply political, as who gets to bear how much responsibility of care and which needs are seen as worthy of being taken care of are deeply political issues intertwined with both everyday politics, social values, and power relations, and with the institutional structures and resources available to acknowledge and meet basic needs. Tronto has laid out 4 phases of caring, like in the initial work, and later she added another phase of caring. And she says that these different analytically separate but interconnected phases of caring are, first is caring about, in which she says that caring about involves the recognition that care is necessary. So this is the first step, according to Tronto, that first one recognizes that care is necessary. Someone notices an unmet caring need, and this notice or assessment of the need is shaped culturally, socially, and politically. The second phase is taking care of, which involves, after the need is assessed, that someone assumes the responsibility to act towards the identified need and determines how to accomplish it. Then comes the third phase, which is caregiving, which involves the actual physical work, that is a direct meeting of needs by coming in contact with the objects of care, or rather the subjects of care. The fourth phase is care receiving, which means that one has the person to whom care is directed has to recognize the care and has to respond to this care. She says that even if the person is not in a position to respond, the care is not complete until the need is met. And it requires again and again looking at the situation and resources assigned to improve that situation. And often it will involve recognizing of new needs, and the process repeats. So she says that care is always present, mostly invisibilized, but it always requires something from us. In her later work in 2013, she identifies the fifth phase of caring, where she says that this final phase, which she terms as caring with, requires that caring needs and the ways in which they are met, they have to be consistent with the democratic commitments to justice, equality, and freedom. So this book is called Caring Democracy. So she's trying to kind of lay out how democratically we can care, and what is the real democracy according to her is then when the caring responsibilities are divided in a just way. So she says that these different phases of care then give rise to different ethical elements of care, or what she calls as moral practices. So it could be attentiveness in the first phase of caring, where one needs to be attentive to the need of caring. Then when one takes care of any care, so any caring need, so she says one has to be responsible. So there is a cultivation of responsibility to take an action in the face of need. Then one has to have competence to carry out caregiving, and then responsiveness to acknowledge that the care has been provided and the needs have been met. With the fifth phase of caring, she says that morality, communication, trust, respect, and solidarity would accompany as moral elements or ethical elements of care for the fifth phase. She argues that these qualities or these different moral practices then help the citizens as both receivers and givers of care, and it helps us to think seriously about the nature of caring needs in the society. She says that care involves making judgments about needs, conflicting needs, strategies for achieving ends, responsiveness of care receivers, and therefore, I've also mentioned Sarah Ruddick's work here, who in her work on maternal thinking in 1989 lays out that how caring leads to certain rationality of care. So one can also see certain emergent epistemologies through care. So it's not a solitary individual activity, but a very social activity, and it's not reduced to only affect, but involves rationality, its own rationality. Now there has been a lot of conversation since yesterday on whether sex work can be seen as care work or not, or is bringing care in conversation with sex work, which is the main theme of the symposium. Is it fruitful at this juncture, where in the name of care, we rather get governance care or carceral care? So though I don't directly work in sex work, and I don't have ethnographic material to support what I'm saying as, but I take instances from what all you've been speaking since yesterday. So I would still argue that care ethics as an approach can offer possibilities of looking at sex workers as epistemic agents. Sex workers make judgments about the best ways to sustain themselves and their families. They are attentive to the needs of their own and people around them, and they take responsibility to fulfill those needs. They are not just caregivers, but by virtue of being caregivers, they can also be looked at care receivers, as Toronto lays out that a democratic setup of care shall be one that recognizes that we all require care at one or the other time in our lives. More fruitfully, one can look at, and I have there mentioned another care ethicist, Eva Petakite's idea of doulia principle, which comes from doula, by which she means caring for those who care. So she says that caring does not, the caring does not deplete the caregiver in her conception of social cooperation for a just society. So the concept of doulia signifies the service that is rendered to those who become needy by virtue of attending to those in need, so that all can be cared for. So these two extra references of Ruddick and Kitty I've just mentioned here to make further connections. So I have focused my analysis on Toronto's analysis. Now, in conclusion, the way commercial sex workers seem to be currently cared for by the government and by anti-trafficking NGOs, like the one which took objection to the fact that they should not be called as workers. So they, in their sense, they take care of sex workers by locating their identities as someone who are always traumatized, are always trafficked, and are perennial victims who are in the need of rescue or repatriation. It is not to dismiss the existence of trafficking, but to bring out the voices of sex workers that we have been hearing since yesterday from various parts of the world. Denial of any epistemic agency to the sex workers is to fail at the care that the state or NGO, such NGOs are hoping to provide for. And following the phases and elements of care as laid down by Toronto, and which I have mentioned in previous slides, one sees that there is a top-down identification and assessment of needs of sex workers on the part of the government and such NGOs, which raises questions on how much attention. And here I kind of reflect on the ethical element of care, different ethical elements of caring that Toronto has pointed out, that how much attention is paid to the actual needs of sex workers and how responsible the present form of care given towards them is. Given the voices and resistance on the part of the sex workers against their criminalization is not factored in when such instances like the revision of the advisory, which as I mentioned was at the first place drafted with the inputs from the National Network of Sex Workers in India, and once it was revised and their mention was removed from informal workers, there was huge agitation against that. So when something like this happens, we find a gross failure at the level of responsiveness on the part of the state and such anti-trafficking NGOs. There could be nothing more important than the voices of the sex workers themselves, because when we hear them, these are not all rosy stories, but the insistence on looking at the issue of exploitation that they want to raise, like the cases of sexual harassment, hurdles in filing reports at police stations in such cases, issues with accommodation, children's education, healthcare, intersection with caste identity in India, and marginalized sexual and gender minorities who are involved in sex work. So they can have several other issues around exploitation that they want to raise, but under this paternalistic kind of top-down approach of government and NGOs, we fail at caring. So the state fails at taking care in a very well way of the sex workers. Here, I have also kind of mentioned in the last point an example by Niina. I just happened to listen to her in another webinar a few days ago, where she was talking about criminalizing the sex via the Nordic model. And there she also mentions that what we need to do is to centralize the voices, like to involve sex workers in the policy making. And that's what I'm also saying, trying to kind of, move towards in my analysis, that by looking at care ethics and ethics of care, care ethics or ethics of care, so this is used interchangeably as the name of this philosophical approach, one can centralize the voices and relational identities of sex workers. And the recent directive of Supreme Court of India that was mentioned by Professor Prabha Kotishwaran also yesterday, where they have said that anyone, like everyone, each worker has to, be at kind of given the space of dignity. So they kind of just fell short of saying that sex workers are workers, but they mentioned that police brutality, they kind of raised issue about police brutality, and the panel of Supreme Court also mentioned that how media has to be careful in their covering of these stories, and these points were mentioned by Professor Prabha yesterday. So what I'm trying to say that these such directives of Supreme Court could be a step forward towards caring well for sex workers and to identify them as epistemic agents. In conclusion, I would say that looking at caring well from the lens of care ethics has a transformative potential to establish sex workers as epistemic agents, and thereby has the potential for pushing for positive policy changes. So that is it from my side. And again, I have not done any ethnographic work on care ethics. I work on surrogacy. It is my first attempt to look at sex work from the lens of care, and it has been possible because of the wonderful panel that has been put together by Niina and Sharmila. So thank you so much. And I look forward to feedback.
Yeah. Thank you, Priya. Thank you for laying out for us the Toronto's ideas of ethics of care and caring democracies, and also discussing the kind of connectivities between surrogacy and sex work, and kind of the problems that both of these labors face. Now we move to Sharmila. Sharmila will talk about sex workers' motherhood and politics of virtuous labor. So please go ahead, Sharmila.
Hi, everyone. So I do not have slides because I actually prefer reading for events like this. So what I'll do is I'll give you first a sense of my overall project, and then I'll talk about the specific bit I want to focus on for this. And that's the bit I'm still trying to work out in my head as I write all of this out. So I would appreciate feedback. So my overall project, where I was starting, was I wanted to critique the Philippine anti-trafficking sector's conflation of sex work with victimhood, and show that this conflation is inconsistent with the lived realities of many sex workers, much like everyone in this conference. So using a framework that foregrounds sex workers' speech practices, self-representations, and reflections on their own work, I argue that there is a mixture of, choice and coercion in my interviewees' engagement with sex work, but they were not victims in need of rescuing. It was better than their realistic alternatives. It allowed them to contest their displacement in the labor market and resist gendered, low-paid, and labor-intensive jobs. Social stigma undermined their esteem, their self-worth, and their ability to exercise agency. But they also reworked social scripts by distinguishing their work as clean and honest, in contrast to the hypocrisy of the moral entrepreneurs who were trying to stop them. So partially as a reactive form of self-construction, or at least I argue this, many saw their engagement in sex work as a moral project through which they demonstrated virtue as mothers and daughters. Some saw themselves as entrepreneurial, capitalizing on their attractiveness and the male demand for sex. Some saw themselves as victims, but the use of the word victim is very different. It was more victims of poverty, stigma, and restrictive policies, not victims of male violence necessarily. And then I make recommendations on the basis of this that are in line with what many of us have already talked about. So in this presentation, I'm less preoccupied with a trafficking dimension. I'm also less preoccupied with caring work within the context of the affective and sexual labor that sex workers perform for clients. I am more concerned with caring work as a way in which sex workers perform their role as mothers. And I am also very concerned about the limitations of this perspective as a political or analytical category. And that's what I'm trying to work out. So just some quick notes about my methodology. I use two methods. I use discourse analysis to understand how women's rights and anti-trafficking orgs represent sex work as a problem to be solved. And I did collaborative research with Filipino sex workers, so to compare what both sides are saying. So I worked with the Philippine Sex Workers Collective. It's an informal alliance of Filipino sex workers. And in my initial encounters with them, they made very clear that they don't trust feminist academics, researchers, and journalists, and fair enough. So one of them said something that was really foundational to how I did research. One of the leaders says, in a world where selling sex is dirty and immoral, what do you expect us to say? Will we really admit that we enjoy it? We know what researchers and reporters want to hear. So it's easier to say we desperately need money to feed our families, or that we were tricked into this, than to admit that we preferred it. And so these methodological challenges are well documented by people like Frances Shaver or Laura Augustine. So they say, look, stigmatized populations are going to tell you what you want to hear if they have concerns about privacy, confidentiality, and social judgment, or if they know that healthcare services or avoiding arrest, requires them to provide a performance of victimhood. So I just want to clarify that in my research process, I did think through how to get past these hurdles and to build a lot of trust. And that's important because I am interrogating their self-presentations to me as well, right? And so I worked quite closely with the Philippine collective, and my research method tried to mitigate against these risks. So it was collective storytelling. It's adapted from Filipino psychology. We were in someone's home or parks or houses or even karaoke. There was dancing, there was art, there was photo voice, there was shared meals. They were welcome to ask me questions as well. So it was not just about like extracting knowledge, but also making sure that I created a space where people felt safe and they were actually enjoying the process as well. And it's important because Filipino sex workers rarely had space to convene socially and reflect on their work or share their experiences. And so many of those who've met through these gatherings have stayed friends, and some of them have become more politically active. So some of them actually described the process as therapy, almost like therapy for them. So it's heartwarming to meet other sex workers and to know that people care about their thoughts. So this was the environment in which some of these, self-presentations and disclosures were taking place. And as a political project in my analysis, I foreground quotes from sex workers quite extensively, and you'll see that because I think of it as having to mitigate against the erasure of sex workers in academic and policy conversations. So the theme of motherhood now. So most of my interlocutors identified their role as mothers and providers as their main motivation for engaging in sex work. Most of them were mothers, and most of their children were under 15, so young kids. A third of those who were married or living with a male partner were separated from their previous long-term partners. More than half were single mothers at the time of the interview or had been single for a significant period, which influenced their decision to choose sex work over other low-paying, less flexible jobs. Not all mothers lived with their children, as some, especially those with more than one child, have had to split their children up, so keeping one or two with them and trusting the others to different households, such as the grandparents or their former partners. So everyone with more than 2 children, which was most of them, indicated that their children had different biological fathers. Nonetheless, regardless of where their children lived, most women were the primary financial providers for most or all of their children. And for many of these interlocutors, they spoke about the importance of physical presence, and they were pushing back against traditional expectations in the Philippines for women to work to migrate or to relocate to work as domestic workers overseas, which is fairly common, or even in households in the Philippines. So they're pushing back against that. Niina, who was 19, turned to sex work after she gave birth at 18 and was abandoned by the child's father. I need to support my child. I did not want to be a domestic worker because why will I take care of other people's children and live like a slave with a different family for 2,000, maybe 3,000 pesos? It's about $80 a month if I'm lucky. What about my own child? How can I be a good mother if I leave my own child to care for other people's children? The next theme that I identified was this tension between being stigmatized as a bad mother and as survival. I'm using pseudonyms all throughout. So Bea was offered assistance by an NGO to give up sex work. So she goes, I was invited to a seminar by an NGO, WIDPRO. They offered to send me to school. I had to work late nights after school. It wasn't doable, especially with my child. They provided me with a small stall to sell barbecue outside the bar I used to work at. My friends and former clients would walk by and encourage me to just go back in and go back to my old life. I held firm for a few months. I really tried. I wanted to stop for my child so that he won't be bullied in school when his friends find out his mother is a whore. But I can't. We need the money. Now I sell baked goods and cook meals on the side, but it's not possible to give up sex work completely. There are also those who were pushing back against restrictive norms. So Erica, whose children were shamed by members of their religious group because of her work as a sex worker, said to the group, so she confronted them and said, did you feed my kids with your clean money? And to me, she said, if they throw moral questions at us, then I would like to know how they define what is moral and good. I, who have 4 children, whom I did my best to raise, or my husband, whose only contribution was to get me pregnant, beat me, and provide nothing for our kids. Many of them acknowledged feeling shame about their work and its effects on their loved ones. But some of them, including those who were not members of the collective, so not politicized, right, clearly stated that they had no reason to be ashamed, even if society looked down on them, right? And there were many other quotes here, like, yes, they judged me, it is shameful, but you know what's more shameful? Being a mother who cannot feed my children. Won't you also feel shame if you're forced to watch your child starve, or if you need to make them work instead of going to school, or if they go to school but with a dirty uniform and no lunch? Don't we also judge those mothers? So these self-construction strategies suggest a process of self-identifying with other honest laborers who contribute to the welfare of their families, as opposed to deviant or duped even women, right? And most of them were actually Roman Catholics, but I would hear things like, my priest talks about sexual purity all the time, but what about feeding my children? What about being a good mother? I think God forgives me. So I was struck by this strong emphasis many of them placed on their role as mothers. because they constantly came up against social workers, policemen, state agencies who repeatedly told them that they were lazy, irresponsible mothers. So that's a big part of the anti-trafficking discourse, actually, whose children would be ashamed of them. And so they felt guilt and humiliation, but they also felt resentment because sex work was actually the best way to carry out their duty as mothers and providers. And so given this information, I am looking at it from a two-tiered analytical lens. One is, I think this data is useful and important in challenging the discursive opposition between sex work and motherhood. And this is important. And here I'm taking off from what ECP said yesterday, Nikki and Charlotte, because it is de-exceptionalizing sex work. And in that sense, it is a valuable political project. And in a way, it allows us to look at sex work as social reproduction. But here, I'm not talking about it again in the context of sexual or affective labor for clients, or that the logic of you're providing labor to sustain the formal workforce, but in the context of providing for their families' economic and social needs. So Gauri Vijayakumar, who also looks at motherhood and sex work, argues that analyzing sex workers' accounts of sex work as part of the practice of good motherhood helps center the agency of sex working mothers without discounting the possibility of agency within a system of exploitation defined by patriarchy, caste, class. What I would add to this is that troubling conceptions of good motherhood is important, and asserting sex workers as good mothers does some work there, because the idea of good motherhood, respectable motherhood, has been used to justify keeping women in low-paid exploitative forms of work in the name of not shaming their children, in the name of setting a good example, not losing their children, because some children get taken away when people are coded as bad mothers who work around sex workers and drug users. So we challenge this conception of respectable motherhood, which has been used to discipline women laborers, actually. But then this analytical framework also does come with risks. And I don't think the solution is a binary either or, but I'm just thinking through my reservations about the motherhood category as well. One is that danger that it creates hierarchies of virtue. So the virtuous sex worker who is a long-suffering, self-sacrificing mother, and a selfish one. Why shouldn't sex workers be able to just enjoy the work? Why shouldn't they find the material rewards and the attention of the client's personal rewarding? It might require people then to keep demonstrating a facade of self-sacrifice in order to justify the work. Second, it may reinforce exceptionalism by suturing access to rights or social recognition to the social value of one's work. And then I ask, on what terms are we claiming citizenship rights for sex workers? On what terms do certain groups of people become deserving of care and love? So just as a rhetorical strategy, but I don't think we should abandon it, by the way, to make that clear. I'm just identifying the risks. The last one, the last paragraph here is, there is still a risk of reinforcing neoliberal governance then in that. So Wendy Brown calls this an economic rationality, where political agents are recreated into economic agents whose worth and virtue is measured by their capacity for future self-care, which Brown defines as the ability to provide for their own needs or needs of their children. So then it might actually reinforce the idea that indeed you are responsible for your children. Indeed, this is the duty of mothers to provide for their children. And is that a discursive framework that we want to reinforce, or how do we then be mindful of the risk and not reinforcing that? But at the same time, this is a critique of the neoliberal framework and not sex workers. And within this framework, individuals are judged based on their earning power and ability to provide for themselves and families. So it is important to have a broader conversation about the pitfalls of neoliberalism as a political and economic rationality, but in a way that recognizes that it governs most of our lives, not just sex workers. So I argue that sex workers are subjects in the world, and in this case, that happens to be a world where one's craftiness, entrepreneurship, and money-making skills are valorized. So it's not a special form of disempowerment for them to conceive of personal success based on these characteristics. So what I'm working through in my writing now is how to weave all of these things together. And in the final chapter, when I make proposals for how the strategies can be framed to think through the pitfalls without giving up on the very real, caring work and highlighting the very real caring work that sex workers perform as mothers. All right, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Sharmila. I think your talk really kind of like wrapped up the of this panel, which really much was around respectability and how it functions in self narratives, but also in kind of politics of sex work and understandings of care and sex work in general. So I now open the floor for questions. So if you have any questions for the panelists, please either type question in the chat box or type your question in there. And also, if panelists, you have any comments or questions for each other, I would be open for that. Okay, so Inga has a question, so I will turn the floor to Inga.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for lots of great discussions and presentations. I have more sort of a kickoff for like maybe thoughts and ideas than a real question. I noticed in the last set of presentations, the notion of virtue coming up both in self-descriptions of sex workers, but also like in the context of accessing virtue through like good motherhood or being defined as performing care, etc. And I was sort of, Sharmila already pointed this out to a degree, but sort of how do we grapple with this notion that in order to be like socially acceptable women, sex workers are supposed to be virtuous, and is like this notion of creating virtue, is that something that we should want or participate in? And how do we how do we create, trying to find another word that is not also loaded. I was going to say legitimacy, but that also is loaded. So, so how do we create acceptance and a different view that is not reinforcing patriarchal notions of how women should be? And I don't have answers. I only have questions about this.
You know, I was just gonna make an observation here. When I was younger, my gut instinct was to say, it's so unfair that we are holding sex workers to a higher bar that we are not holding other workers to. We don't require the social value of someone's work to be the basis for granting them labor rights, which I think is true for some jobs. But as I get older and get more exposed to different forms of gendered and precarious women's labor, and I take a step back from it, I'm like, actually we do, and we do for women, right? So we do it for domestic workers. Like part of the reason there's like so much valorization of domestic work is because of its social value, which in some ways kind of masks the exploitative dimension of it. In the context of the Philippines, at least, so we are known as a migrant exporting country, which means we have a lot of like low-waged women migrant workers. The popular assumption is that they leave out of economic necessity, but actually that's not true. Like if in a strictly like technical sense, it is not the poorest of the poor who migrate. It's usually people who can afford placement fees, who have some degree of financial mobility. And so increasingly more researchers have argued that obviously monetary incentives play a role, but there are other incentives that play there, like freedom, escaping boredom, escaping your rural environment, escaping your husband, a desire for life, other aspirations. But in order to legitimize their move away from the husband, away from the family, away from these patriarchal structures, in order to justify working by themselves overseas, the common refrain you hear, almost like a script, is it's for my family. So I realized it's not just actually sex workers who suffer now from this whole need to demonstrate virtue in order to access some degree of mobility, some degree of independence on the part of certain women workers, sometimes in the middle class, sometimes lower middle class, is something women share. So maybe that's important to point out, but it doesn't fully answer Inga's question either.
Yeah, I would want to kind of add to what Sharmila said, and then I'll also take the example of surrogates. So what happens in that case, because like Sharmila was saying, yet another precarious work, where what the state has done is it has made it unpaid by pointing to various virtues that a normal ideal mother should have, and a normal ideal mother should not be paid for bearing children. So the idea is that a surrogate could also bear children for, say, anyone else, an intended parent, only out of care and concern. So the point is that also how the dominant perspective, and here, like example, I'm typically talking about state, already puts certain virtues on certain forms of women's work. And then I do understand what Inga is saying, that there might be some kind of downside also to always just look at the virtue and the social value and keep on reiterating that for certain kinds of work. But I feel it can be one of the fruitful ways to also then push back against the other kind of virtues that are put on these kinds of work, and same with sex work. So what I was trying to say in my, in middle part of my presentation was that with surrogates, of course, now like they have kind of made only altruistic surrogacy as the permissible form of surrogacy, but it is still allowed, though they are not seen as workers. But in sex work, there's no way they are going to legitimize them as workers, though Supreme Court has said and has come out with some guidelines, but they have also fallen short of speaking about sex workers as workers. And there, I guess, there is a lot of role to be played by these NGOs, which are anti-trafficking NGOs, because their narrative is taken as the prominent narrative, and the virtues that they kind of assign to sex workers as always traumatized and always wronged women. I guess that, I think to push back against that, I believe that maybe care ethics can be one of the ways to kind of, being mindful to all its own paternalistic tendencies that care can have. But I guess if we look at the decolonized and we bring in transsexual feminism, I guess we can have some fruitful ways to look at such kind of precarious works.
Abhilasha and Tanya, do you want to say something about the virtue and in relation to your work on bar dancers?
Yeah, just to sort of add on to discussion, of course, there's no possible, we're a long way away from finding a solution to how we can probably move beyond these questions. But just to add on from and drawing from both of your answers itself, that especially in context of India, with sex work, with regards to sex work, there's also a discourse that how it's a necessary evil, where it needs to exist. So in order for the society, for the sort of society to remain in order, so there is that sort of a space where you need some sort of deviation so that structures of family, that institution can survive. So and in addition to this is the idea that virtue and access to virtue is also hierarchized. So in some sense that surrogacy then probably would have more virtue than sex work would, and then we're constantly sort of negotiating, even with the idea of bar dancing, when bar dance in some sense could be given more sort of modesty and more sort of a decent platform by arguing for certain things, that they're fully covered, they wear Indian clothes, and they dance on Bollywood numbers which are already already popular. So that is in some sense, then there is this claim for virtue that one makes, and what it does is that it automatically starts excluding and sort of categorizing, and which is something that is sort of like a circle that we continue to established.
And also drawing from what Doris just said in the chat, there is a logic of meritocracy here, which directly draws from the logic of caste, and which caste of women would eventually pass off as virtuous, as modest, and which ones probably would never, in that sense. And like Tanya also pointed out, and that's what our attempt was also to sort of put it out there, that in a larger conversation around sexual labor, there have been hierarchies where bar dancers had to be made more virtuous by removing the sexual aspect of it. So yeah.
Thank you, Abhilasha and Tanya, for your contribution, and also pointing out kind of how the virtue is also attached to caste and class and other markers of difference. And we have a question from Nibedita, and it is for Sharmila. How do you perceive pleasure in the context of sex work and motherhood?
So the first thing I'm going to say is, knowing that they are able to fulfill their roles as mothers is a source of esteem, is a source of pride, a source of happiness. So that I'm not going to even, pretend is like false consciousness or performative, like that's real, right? Beyond that though, I did get suspicious as a researcher, because in my first meetings with everyone was just talking about motherhood, almost like a script, right? And I was just like, surely there might be more to this. And I think being able to communicate as a researcher that you are not judgmental kind of helps uncover the more private transcripts, because you have your front stage and you have your backstage. And as you build more trust with a community, they let you in. So eventually it is starting to be revealed, some of them start cracking jokes because someone's client gave her a smartphone. And someone's client paid for her really nice gold braces. Or, they start talking about the presents they receive from the clients, or the fact that they enjoy attention from their clients. They enjoy the holidays. And I realize these are not, diametrically opposed things. These are not mutually exclusive things. They do care about, sex work is a central modality by which they can fulfill their role as mothers. But at the same time, there is an element of it that is personally rewarding, that is fun. And some of them would say things to me like, what, are you going to rescue me and give me like a brush to scrub your toilet, when they first thought that I was with anti-trafficking, right? Or they were like, why do you think the kitchen is a better place to be than the bar, right? So there is a dimension there of excitement, of avoiding the drudgery of domestic work that cannot be separated from good motherhood. And that's what I'm trying to grapple with in my work. Like, I want to make sure that complexity is honored, both theoretically but also like politically down the line. So that's my short answer to you.
I actually would like to pose a question. So I don't know if this is kind of for all of you, because I think it's really interesting, like thinking in relation to earlier talks and also this panel. I was just wondering in general how respectability can be a tool and a hindrance in politics and self-representation of sex workers. So it would be really nice if you could reflect on that related to your work. Would you like to start, Priya, or how do you feel?
Yeah, I can. So I think you've kind of, pointed out something which is at the center of why sex work is kind of criminalized. I think respectability, and I'll kind of add to what Abhilasha and Tanya were saying, that how there has to be maintenance of a very core of society which is seen as family, and to maintain that there has to be certain respectable way in which the sexual contact is maintained, and there where it is for your lawful husband who can then rape you under marital rape, but that is not legal, that is not seen as rape in India at least. So the willful paid sex is criminalized, but marital rape is still kind of decriminalized in India. So I guess respectability is something which is very crucial to the entire conversation around sex work. But I guess sex work from the side of sex worker unions also, yesterday also what Nikki and Charlotte was saying, and through the presentations we've seen, I think for them, respect by the virtue of being workers is something which I kind of have gathered that sex workers have been trying to kind of claim. And this can take various ways, that it can be through them being mothers, it can be through them being the sole earning members of their families, it can be through the fact which Sharmila said, that maybe they can't say it, or they feel that because we are criminalized in the country, so we can't say that we want to do it because it pays us better. But I guess again, respectability is something which is utilized as a potent tool from both ends, to speak against sex work and also from sex workers. So I think it is also that kind of double-edged sword with this concept. And I'm sure that, Abhilasha and Sharmila would have more to add.
Do you want to continue, Abhilasha and Tanya?
I think to add on, I guess, I'm also thinking out loud that where do these sort of terms of respectability come from? And so my PhD thesis is concerned with sort of 19th century politics and how female leaders sort of negotiate with power and how they self-represent themselves and so on. And the idea there, and what I think we can also sort of bring here, is that how motherhood becomes that sort of ultimate position or status that allows you some political power as well. And you're heard, you're listened to, even if you're younger, you're respected by sort of kings and government sort of officials because of the position that you have. And particularly in India, I think we have a sort of a long history of how sort of motherhood has become this iconic virtuous thing. So then, and to move on to even say to be sole sort of earners of the family or other such terms. So then I think the point would be also to look at where do these terms emerge from? What is like the history of what is the acceptability of that sort of representation, right? So if there is through motherhood, I think at least in India, I can say that you can get a lot done. You can in that.
Yes, and I guess one thing that we sort of wanted to bring up in the discussion was also the idea of consent that's heavily relying on respectability, which is to say, like, even if you go back to the history of the idea of consent in legal jurisdictions or jurisprudence in India, it is deeply rooted in an idea of a respectable upper caste Hindu marriage, which is to do with child marriage and protecting the figure of child, which again was translated into protecting her because you have to protect her potential to be a mother or to reproduce and carry the lineage. So I guess in that sense,
I guess to perhaps sort of to add, then I guess one would, as Sharmila pointed out, that there's this front stage and a backstage where in the front you sort of constantly talk about you're doing this for the family, you're doing this for the children, and you can't talk about pleasure or fun or just the fact that you probably don't want to follow a sort of some of the time you can also think that there's an alternative way of living or surviving, right? So those conversations are unable to take center stage because as we try to also talk with bar dance was that it had to be termed in a certain way, it had to be given a certain direction in order to even recognize these women as agents or subjects of feminist advocacy,
respectable subjects for feminist advocacy.
I guess for me, I'm gonna take my lead from the collective, the Philippine Sex Workers Collective that I collaborate with. What they do is a mix of both. So they emphasize and highlight the role of mothers among sex workers, and it's true. It's just empirically true that many of them are mothers, right? And in some ways, there's some de-exceptionalizing that's happening there. And given how stigmatized it is in the Philippines, that's just important. But second, they still push back. So respectability articulations in sex work politics are many tiered, right? So there's the motherhood version, but there's also the version of higher end sex workers who are like, I don't sell sex, like I sell company, or in the Philippines, at least research has shown that cam models, for example, are like, I'm not a sex worker, I'm a performer, right? I'm a content creator, I don't sell sex. So there are all of those like virtue signaling, social distancing things happening within the movement that also revolves around respectability. So what the collective does is they call that out. They're like, oh no, like you shouldn't be ragging on the street workers. That's going to destroy the movement. Like we live and die together here. So they do a combination of where it's true, the motherhood angle is pushed, but at the same time, there's also a push against. Like it's like, no, this is not what all that we are. We are more than this as well. It's tricky though. It's tricky to operationalize.
Yeah, Abhilasha.
Just to sort of add to what I was earlier saying as well, that there's also a flip side to this sort of iconization as mothers. Particularly in India, if you see that there are hardly sort of any scope to talk about complexities of motherhood itself, in the sense that, only recently, there are discussions about postpartum depression, or sort of the complexities or the medical practices related to childbirth. So while it is a term that one can use to legitimize, there is also this flip side of that. What does it not allow for us to talk about?
Thank you. Any more comments from the panelists? Any more questions from the audience? Doris commented that I love your use of government's front stage and backstage, and I think it's also relates to this respectability debate quite a lot. So what we do in the front and the back with this question.
I think Doris.
Yeah, can I ask one?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I didn't see you. Yeah,
sorry, I put up my hand and then I was like, I'm probably not on your screen. Sorry. I love all of the ideas and everything is just chiming so well between all of the panels, which is great. So again, well done, Niina and Sharmila, for bringing it all together. But like, I think as well what you've just said there about the motherhood and the complexities of that. And it's just, isn't it so interesting, because it's going back again to yesterday, and when there was those talks about how do we, bring us and other less, interested in sex worker rights people together and all that, and those questions of like, maybe what is a good woman, what is a respectable woman, and how much that holds us all back, I suppose, really. So both, whatever we're calling them, anti-sex worker, feminists, whatever, like they're so held in place and held in a hateful place, I would say, by what they're thinking of. People who feel like that they have to say, that actually I'm just doing this for my family. All of those, it's just all playing into that, the hierarchical, patriarchal, etc., that we're all in. So yeah, I just think there's so much scope here for growth.
Thank you, Doris. Like this really points to solidarity, like how all women are kind of like controlled by the good bad binary and respectability to some extent. Maybe this is a good note to end this panel and move to the closing remarks. I want to thank you all, like all the keynotes, the presenters, the chairs, who also did very valuable work moderating the discussion, and of course the participants who kind of created this space for discussion. Thank you so much for everything. I also wanted to give a special thanks to Sharmila here, because she really did the lion's share of all the practical organizing, and this is often the labor that is invisible. So I wanted to really, really thank Sharmila. Symposium possible by financing us. So I just thought that I give you kind of closing marks, trying to summarize some of our discussions and then think about how to go forward from this symposium. So me and Sharmila really wanted to create discussions on the intersections of care and sex work, and really kind of also kind of problematize those connections, but also kind of use them to think possibilities of political organizing. These presentations and discussions we have had here today has really highlighted the myriad ways care figures in the practices, politics and ethics of sex work. And I think also the presentations has really nicely demonstrated both the pitfalls and the potentials of care. So they have shown how sex workers easily become targets of carceral care, and how portraying sex work as care work can also become a form of respectability politics that we just kind of discussed in length at the last panel. However, we have also of care as self-defense, for example, and creation of sex work solidarity at the time of crisis, and also how denoting creating solidarities with other forms of labor. And care can also be seen as an antidote to capitalism. As Nikki Adams from the ECP stated, valuing care is an anti-capitalist demand, because it is a demand for our lives to be respected. And I think that's something I really want to take away from these discussions. Overall, I think the discussions have demonstrated the deeply ambivalent and non-innocent and purely good. And I think there is really a need to move away from understanding of care as a kind of pleasant affection and a feel-good attitude. So care and communities are ambivalent. They are deeply embedded in power relations. So therefore, I think there is a need to continue foster care as well as unsettling it. Discussions, we would like to look into a possibility of making a special issue around these themes, and we'll circle. Please send us abstracts, and we will start working on this. I also want to remind everybody that most of the presentations were recorded, so you can watch them later on at the LSE Gender Studies page, and we'll also inform about this. I think that's all. I just want to thank so yeah, I'm sorry about the audio. My headphones keep on connecting to it. So yeah, but without further ado, I just want to thank everybody and thank all the participants and speakers, and let you go on with your Saturday in a maybe less work centered activities. So thank you, everybody, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Niina and Sharmila. Well done.
Thanks, everyone. This work now feels a lot less lonely.
Yes.
Conference.
Take it to the beach and go for a swim, and who knows what will come up.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.